They were married for 3 years, but they never shared a bed. She went for a routine checkup. The doctor said, "Congrats, she's pregnant." Husband, shocked. How? Why? Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Before we begin, let me offer a prayer, because your love and presence mean everything to me. A prayer for my beautiful family. Heavenly Father, thank you for this beautiful family. Bless their homes with peace, their hearts with love, and their lives with joy. Strengthen them, guide them, and protect them in all they do. Let these stories continue to bring comfort, healing, and hope. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, my beautiful family, I want to share something personal. Binta and I are traveling to New York for a medical checkup with Dr. Bruce Lerman, one of the best cardiologists in the world. Many of you know his name, and we trust God is with us on this journey. For the next 2 to 3 days, James will be here to present the stories. The voice may be his, but the writing, the message, and the love behind it are still mine. Promise me you won't leave the story halfway. Stay with it, feel every moment, and keep us in your prayers. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Have you invited your family and friends to the channel yet? Now let's welcome James. We'll be back soon, with your prayers in our hearts.
When love becomes a prison of hope. 3 years of marriage had taught Barbara Leslie that hope was the cruelest emotion of all. She stood before the ornate mirror in their master bedroom, adjusting the crimson silk dress that had once made Daxon's eyes burn with desire. That was before the drinking, before the coldness, before she learned that some men could look right through you, even when you were standing naked in front of them. Tonight marked their 3rd wedding anniversary, and like a fool, she still believed in miracles. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times. Daxon should have been home an hour ago, but Barbara had stopped expecting punctuality from a man who measured time in whiskey shots rather than minutes. She remembered their 1st anniversary when he'd pulled her into his arms the moment he saw her wearing this dress. "Red looks incredible on you," he'd whispered against her neck. That night she'd believed their marriage might survive anything. How naive she'd been. The dining room looked like a fairy tale. Crystal glasses caught candlelight, casting shadows across the mahogany table. She'd spent hours preparing his favorite meal, braised short ribs, the same dish his mother used to make. The bottle of 1995 Bordeaux, a wedding gift they'd never opened, sat breathing like a promise of better times. Barbara checked her reflection one final time. Her makeup was flawless, her hair swept into an elegant updo showcasing the diamond earrings he'd given her, their first Christmas as husband and wife. Back when he still remembered what love looked like. The elevator's soft chime announced his arrival, and Barbara's heart performed the same pathetic dance: hope, anticipation, and the inevitable crash of disappointment. She positioned herself in the living room, arranging her features into casual elegance rather than desperate longing. The front door opened with unnecessary force. Daxon Ravencrest appeared in the doorway, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His tie hung loose, his dark hair mussed, and his steel-gray eyes held that glassy quality she'd come to know so well. "Happy anniversary, darling," Barbara said softly. Daxon's gaze swept over her without recognition, as if she were furniture. He loosened his tie completely, letting it fall to the floor with careless abandon. "Anniversary?" His voice was rough with exhaustion that came from drowning sorrows rather than working hard. "Right. 3 years." He said it like reading dates off a tombstone. Barbara's smile felt like cracking porcelain. "I made dinner. Your mother's recipe for the short ribs. I thought we could open that bottle of Bordeaux we've been saving, and I ate at the office." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. She could smell the alcohol on his breath, could see the telltale flush that spoke of a long afternoon at whatever bar he frequented. "Of course you did." The words escaped, tinged with more bitterness than she'd intended. Daxon's eyes finally focused on her, but not with warmth. His gaze was cold, analytical, like she was a problem to be solved rather than a woman to be loved. "Don't start, Barbara. I've had a long day." "Every day is a long day for you." She stood up, silk whispering against her legs. "When was the last time we had dinner together? When was the last time we had a conversation that didn't end with you walking away or pouring another drink?" He moved toward the bar cart, his expensive suit wrinkled. "I need a drink." "You've had enough drinks." Watching him reach for the crystal decanter made something twist violently in her chest. Daxon's hand stilled on the bottle. When he turned to face her, his expression was dangerous. "Enough drinks? In my own home? From my own wife?" His laugh was hollow. "That's rich, Barbara." "I'm trying to save our marriage." The confession burst from her lips like a dam breaking. "I'm trying to save us." "Save us?" Daxon poured whiskey into a crystal tumbler. "From what? From the reality that some people just aren't meant to be together. From the fact that love isn't enough to fix everything." Each word hit her like a physical blow. Barbara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. "Do you remember our wedding day? Do you remember the promises we made?" "I remember a lot of things I shouldn't have done." He took a long drink. "But dwelling on the past won't change anything." "What about our future?" Barbara's voice broke. "What about the children we talked about? The life we planned?" Daxon's glass froze halfway to his lips. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret. But it vanished quickly. "Some dreams are just that, Barbara. Dreams. And it's time to wake up." The silence was deafening. Barbara could hear candles crackling in the dining room, could smell the meal that would go uneaten, could feel 3 years of hope crumbling around her feet like ash. "I'm going to bed," Daxon announced, finishing his drink in one gulp. He didn't look at her as he headed toward the hallway. "Daxon, wait." Barbara's voice was barely a whisper, but he heard it. He stopped, but didn't turn around. "I love you. I still love you, despite everything. Doesn't that mean anything?" For a moment, she thought he might turn around, might cross the room and take her in his arms, and tell her that yes, it meant everything, that they could find their way back to each other. Instead, his shoulders sagged as if her words had added another weight to whatever burden he carried. "Love isn't enough, Barbara." It never was. He disappeared down the hallway, leaving her standing alone, surrounded by the evidence of her futile attempt to resurrect something that might have been dead for longer than she'd been willing to admit. Barbara sank onto the cream-colored sofa, her crimson dress spreading around her like spilled wine. The candles continued to flicker, casting shadows that danced mockingly across the walls. She could hear Daxon in his study, the clink of glass against glass, the squeak of his leather chair as he settled in for another night of drinking alone. She stared at her reflection in the black windows overlooking the city, seeing a woman she barely recognized. When had she become so desperate? When had loving someone become synonymous with losing herself? The grandfather clock chimed again, marking another hour in a marriage that felt more like a beautiful prison with each passing day. Barbara closed her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like before it became a weapon turned against her own heart. Tomorrow, she told herself, things would be different. Tomorrow, she would find a way to reach him. Tomorrow, the man she'd married might come home, instead of this bitter stranger who wore his face. But deep down, in a place she wasn't ready to acknowledge, Barbara Leslie was beginning to understand that some prisons weren't locked from the outside. They were built from the inside, one disappointed hope at a time. Chapter 2. Shadows of Doubt. Sometimes the heart sees what the mind refuses to accept. The truth had a way of hiding in plain sight, waiting for the exact moment when you were strong enough to see it, or desperate enough to look. Barbara discovered the first receipt on a Tuesday morning, tucked between the pages of a finance magazine Daxon had left on the kitchen counter. Chez Laurent, the most exclusive French restaurant in the city. $347 for dinner for two. The date made her stomach lurch. Last Thursday, the same night he'd told her he was working late on the Morrison account. She stared at the cream-colored paper until the numbers blurred, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Two people. He'd taken someone to dinner while she'd eaten leftover Chinese food, alone, waiting for him to come home to their empty penthouse. The magazine fell from her trembling fingers, its glossy pages scattering across the marble floor like fallen leaves. Barbara knelt to gather them, and that's when she saw it. Another receipt, this one from Tiffany and Company. A purchase made 3 weeks ago for $2,800. She'd received no gift that day, or any day since their anniversary disaster. Mrs. Ravencrest? Maria, their housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. "Are you all right?" Barbara quickly stuffed the receipts into her purse, forcing a smile that felt like shattered glass. "I'm fine, Maria. Just clumsy this morning." But she wasn't fine. As Maria bustled around the kitchen, Barbara's mind raced through the past few months with surgical precision. The late nights that had become the norm rather than the exception. The phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. The way Daxon's phone was always face down now, protected by a password she didn't know. And the drinking. Always the drinking. She'd told herself it was stress from work, that investment banking was a demanding field, that successful men often had demanding schedules. She'd made excuses for him the way loving wives do, spinning elaborate justifications for behavior that, in the harsh light of morning, looked exactly like what it was. Betrayal. The word sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and undeniable. Barbara spent the rest of the morning searching through Daxon's belongings with the methodical precision of a detective. In his jacket pockets, she found more evidence. A parking stub from the Ritz-Carlton from a night he'd claimed to be at his brother's bachelor party. A business card from a jewelry store she'd never heard of. And strangest of all, a small bottle of aspirin, the expensive kind, from a pharmacy across town, nowhere near his office or their home. Why would he buy aspirin so far from anywhere he normally went? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each one spawning 3 more, until her head pounded with the weight of her suspicions. By noon, Barbara had discovered a pattern of deception so elaborate it would have been impressive if it weren't devastating. Credit card statements hidden in his briefcase showed charges at hotels, restaurants, and shops that told the story of a double life she'd been too blind, or too afraid, to see. She was scheduled to deliver a presentation to the board at Chaffee Industries that afternoon, but her hands shook so badly she could barely hold her notes. The conference room felt suffocating, filled with the scent of leather and ambition and the kind of expensive cologne that reminded her too much of her husband. The marketing metrics for Q3 show a 15% increase in customer engagement across all demographics, Barbara heard herself saying, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. The social media campaigns have been particularly effective in the 25 to 34 age bracket. She could feel eyes on her, not the polite, professional attention of board members, but something more intense. When she looked up from her notes, she met the gaze of Greg Chaffee himself. At 45, Greg commanded attention without demanding it. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit fitted to perfection, but it was his eyes that caught her off guard. They were dark brown, almost black, and they held a warmth she hadn't seen directed at her in years. More unsettling was the concern she saw there, as if he could see right through her professional facade to the woman falling apart underneath. "Excellent work, Mrs. Ravencrest," Greg said when she finished, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made lesser men straighten their ties. Your campaigns have been instrumental in our recent success. Thank you, Mr. Chaffee. Barbara gathered her papers, acutely aware that her hands were still trembling slightly. Could I have a word with you in my office? The request sent a flutter of panic through her chest. Had she given herself away? Could he tell that her mind was anywhere but on marketing metrics and customer engagement? Greg's office was a study in understated power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while rich mahogany furniture and first-edition books spoke of old money and older wisdom. He gestured for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs across from his desk, then surprised her by taking the chair beside her, rather than asserting his authority from behind his desk. "Are you all right, Barbara?" The use of her first name, gentle and unexpectedly intimate, nearly undid her completely. "I'm fine." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Greg leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. In my experience, when someone says they're fine in that particular tone, they're usually anything but. Barbara looked down at her hands, still clutched around her portfolio. "I'm just having a difficult day. Nothing that concerns the company, I assure you." "I'm not asking as your boss," Greg said quietly. "I'm asking as someone who's noticed that you haven't seemed like yourself lately. You're one of our most valued employees, Barbara, but more than that, you're—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You deserve better than whatever is making you look like you haven't slept in weeks." The kindness in his voice was her undoing. Barbara felt tears threatening, hot and shameful behind her eyes. "Mr. Chaffee, I appreciate your concern, but—" "Greg," he corrected gently. "And if you need anything, anything at all, I want you to know that my door is always open." There was something in the way he said it that made Barbara look up, really look at him. Greg Chaffee was known throughout the city as a brilliant businessman, a man who'd built an empire through intelligence and ruthless efficiency. But the man sitting beside her now wasn't the corporate titan she'd expected. He was simply a human being offering kindness to another human being who desperately needed it. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice to manage anything louder. Greg stood and moved to his desk, pulling a business card from his wallet. He wrote something on the back before handing it to her. "My personal number," he explained. "Day or night." Barbara stared at the card, confused by the gesture. "Mr. Chaffee, Greg, I don't understand why you're—" "Because everyone deserves to have someone in their corner," he said simply. "And because I have a feeling you've been fighting your battles alone for too long." The accuracy of his observation hit her like a physical blow. When had anyone last offered her unconditional support? When had someone looked at her and seen not just the polished professional or the dutiful wife, but the woman struggling to hold herself together? Barbara left Greg's office with his business card burning a hole in her purse and her mind spinning with questions she wasn't ready to answer. The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, but underneath the routine of work, a new awareness was taking root. She wasn't imagining things, the receipts, the phone calls, the distance. It all added up to a truth she'd been avoiding for months. Daxon was having an affair. The drive home felt like traveling toward her own execution. Barbara sat in traffic, watching other couples in other cars, and wondered how many of them were living lies as elaborate as her own. At a red light, she watched a man in the car beside her lean over to kiss his wife, and the casual intimacy of the gesture made her chest ache with longing. When had Daxon last kissed her like that? When had he last looked at her with genuine affection rather than thinly veiled irritation? The penthouse felt different when she entered it that evening, not like a home, but like a crime scene where the evidence of her marriage's murder was waiting to be discovered. Barbara poured herself a glass of wine with hands that had finally stopped shaking and settled into the task of searching for the truth she no longer wanted to find but needed to know. She found it in the pocket of his navy cashmere coat, the one he'd worn to what he'd claimed was a business dinner the week before. A single earring, delicate, expensive, and definitely not hers. Barbara held the small piece of jewelry up to the light, watching it sparkle like a tiny star. It was beautiful, the kind of earring a man bought for a woman he wanted to impress, the kind of gift that spoke of intimate knowledge of someone's taste and style, the kind of gift her husband hadn't given her in over a year. She was still holding the earring when she heard Daxon's key in the front door, followed by the familiar sounds of his evening routine. Shoes hitting the marble, briefcase dropped carelessly by the door, the inevitable journey to the bar cart. Barbara slipped the earring into her pocket and arranged her face into a mask of casual curiosity. Tonight, she would confront him. Tonight, she would demand the truth. But as Daxon appeared in the doorway, already reaching for his evening whiskey, Barbara felt her resolve crumble. He looked exhausted, older than his 31 years, and there was something in his posture that spoke of a man carrying unbearable weight. "How was your day?" she asked instead, the question automatic and hollow. Daxon didn't look at her as he poured his drink. "Fine." And there it was, the single word that had become the soundtrack to their marriage. Fine. Everything was always fine, even when nothing was fine at all. Barbara fingered the earring in her pocket and made herself a promise. Tomorrow she would find the courage to shatter the lie they were living. Tomorrow she would demand the truth. But tonight she would pretend just a little longer that her marriage might somehow survive the secrets that were slowly killing it from the inside out. Chapter 3. The night. Everything changed. One moment of weakness leads to unexpected power. Some nights change everything, not because of what you planned, but because of what you finally had the courage to stop pretending. Barbara stared at her reflection in the ladies' room mirror of the Grand Millennium Hotel, trying to convince herself she belonged at Chaffee Industries' annual gala. The black evening gown she'd chosen was stunning, off-the-shoulder silk that hugged her curves before flowing into an elegant train. But she felt like she was wearing a costume for a play she no longer understood. Daxon was supposed to be her date tonight. 3 hours ago, he'd called to cancel with some excuse about an emergency client meeting that they both knew was a lie. She could have stayed home, could have curled up with a book and a bottle of wine, and pretended that being stood up by her own husband was just another minor disappointment in a marriage full of them. Instead, she'd come alone. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the kind of understated opulence that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. Barbara nursed a glass of champagne and watched other couples dance, their movements fluid and intimate in a way that made her chest ache with longing. When had she last danced with Daxon? When had he last looked at her the way these men looked at their partners? With pride, with desire, with the simple pleasure of being in her company. "You look like you're planning someone's murder." Barbara turned to find Greg Chaffee beside her, devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo. His dark eyes held that same warmth she'd noticed in his office, but tonight there was something else, an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Just contemplating the general futility of human existence," she replied, surprised by her own honesty. The champagne had loosened her tongue, or maybe it was simply the relief of talking to someone who actually seemed to see her. Greg's laugh was rich and genuine. "That's quite philosophical for a Friday night, though I have to say if you're going to contemplate futility, this is the place to do it. Nothing quite like a room full of people spending obscene amounts of money on charity auctions to really put life in perspective." "Spoken like a true cynic," Barbara said, taking another sip of champagne. "I wouldn't have expected that from the great Greg Chaffee." "The great Greg Chaffee?" He raised an eyebrow, amusement dancing in his dark eyes. I think you've been reading too many business magazines. I'm just a man who's good at making money and even better at spending it on causes that make me feel less guilty about making it in the first place." There was something refreshingly honest about his self-deprecation. Barbara found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. "And here I thought you were some kind of business deity, dispensing wisdom from your ivory tower." "Ivory tower? My office is on the 40th floor. That's barely a ivory mid-rise." Greg's smile faded slightly as he studied her face. "Where's your husband tonight?" "I was looking forward to meeting the man who managed to marry the most brilliant marketing mind in the city." The question hit Barbara like a slap. She could lie, could make up some excuse about Daxon being busy with work or family obligations. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. "He's not coming. He had more important things to do." Something shifted in Greg's expression, a flash of anger that was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "His loss," he said simply, but the words carried a weight that made Barbara's heart skip. "Would you like to dance?" Greg extended his hand, palm up, waiting for her answer. Barbara hesitated. Dancing with her boss at a company function was one thing, but this felt different. More personal, more dangerous. "I shouldn't," she said, even as her body swayed toward him. "Probably not," Greg agreed, his hand still extended. "But when was the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because you should?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Barbara looked around the ballroom, at all the couples lost in their own private worlds, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd done anything simply for the joy of it. She placed her hand in his. Greg led her onto the dance floor with the confidence of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. His hand settled on the small of her back, warm through the silk of her dress, and Barbara felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. The electric thrill of being truly wanted by someone who knew her worth. They moved together like they'd been dancing for years, her body responding to his lead with an ease that should have been impossible between two people who barely knew each other. The music swirled around them, a slow jazz number that spoke of late nights and whispered confessions, and Barbara allowed herself to pretend, just for these few minutes, that she was a woman who was cherished rather than tolerated. "You're a beautiful dancer," Greg murmured against her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "You're not bad yourself," Barbara replied, acutely aware of how perfectly she fit against him, how right this felt in a way that nothing in her life had felt right for months. "Barbara," Greg said, and something in his voice made her look up at him. His dark eyes were serious now, searching her face with an intensity that made her feel naked, despite her elegant gown. "I need you to know that I see you. Not just as an employee, not just as a marketing executive, but as a woman who deserves so much more than whatever is making her look like she's drowning." The words hit Barbara like a physical blow. She'd worked so hard to maintain her professional facade, to keep her personal pain separate from her career, and here was this man seeing right through all her carefully constructed walls. "Greg, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just needed you to know that someone sees you, someone recognizes your worth." The song ended, but neither of them moved to separate. They stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by other couples, but existing in their own bubble of awareness. Barbara could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could see the same desperate hunger in Greg's eyes that she knew was reflected in her own. "I should go," she whispered, but she made no move to step away from him. "Should," Greg repeated, his thumb tracing a small circle on her back that sent shivers down her spine. "There's that word again." Before Barbara could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She pulled it from her small clutch with trembling fingers, already knowing what she would find. "Won't be home tonight." "Don't wait up." The casual cruelty of it, the complete disregard for her feelings, for their marriage, for the basic courtesy one human being owed another, shattered something inside Barbara's chest. She stared at the message until the words blurred, feeling Greg's concerned gaze on her face. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Barbara looked up at him, this man who had shown her more kindness in one evening than her husband had in months, and felt something reckless and desperate unfurl in her chest. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she'd felt in years. "Actually, I think it might be very good news." What happened next felt inevitable, like the conclusion to a story that had been writing itself for months without her conscious awareness. Greg took her hand and led her from the ballroom, past the glittering crowd, and up to his penthouse suite on the top floor of the hotel. Neither of them spoke during the elevator ride, but the air between them crackled with possibility and barely restrained desire. The suite was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights, while understated luxury spoke of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. But Barbara barely noticed the surroundings. All her attention was focused on Greg, who stood watching her with an expression that was part reverence, part hunger. "Are you sure?" he asked, and the fact that he was giving her a chance to change her mind, to walk away, only made her want him more. Instead of answering with words, Barbara stepped closer and placed her hand against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. "I haven't been sure of anything in 3 years," she said, "but I'm sure of this." Greg's self-control snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. His hands framed her face with reverent gentleness, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones like she was made of precious glass. When he kissed her, it was with the kind of desperate hunger that spoke of a man who had been starving without realizing it. Barbara melted into him, her body responding to his touch with an eagerness that shocked her. This was what passion felt like, she realized with stunning clarity. This electric connection, this feeling of being completely alive in someone else's arms. This was what she'd been missing, what she'd convinced herself she didn't need. Greg's hands were gentle but sure as he helped her out of her evening gown, his eyes never leaving hers, as silk pooled at her feet like spilled ink. When he told her she was beautiful, the words carried a conviction that made her believe him. When he worshipped her body with his hands and mouth, it was with a reverence that made her feel like a goddess, rather than a woman who had been made to feel invisible for far too long. They made love with the desperate intensity of two people who had been drowning and suddenly found air. Greg touched her like she was precious, loved her like she was cherished, and for the first time in years, Barbara felt like she was home. Afterward, they lay tangled in expensive sheets, Barbara's head pillowed on Greg's chest, while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows like fallen stars, and Barbara felt a peace she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. "I should feel guilty," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Greg's hand stilled for a moment before resuming its gentle caress. "Do you?" Barbara considered the question seriously. She should feel guilty. She was a married woman who had just spent the night with another man, but all she felt was a strange sense of rightness, as if she'd finally done something that aligned with her true self rather than the person she'd been pretending to be. "No," she said, surprised by her own honesty. "I should, but I don't." "Good," Greg said simply. "You deserve to feel wanted, Barbara. You deserve to feel cherished." They talked until dawn, sharing stories and dreams and fears in the way that lovers do when they've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Greg told her about building his company from nothing, about the loneliness that came with success, about how he'd learned to fill his life with achievements because he'd never found someone worth sharing them with. Barbara found herself confessing her disappointment in her marriage, her growing awareness that she'd been living a lie, her fear that she'd wasted the best years of her life on a man who couldn't see her worth. When the sun began to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Barbara knew that everything had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had entered the ballroom alone and heartbroken. She was someone who had remembered what it felt like to be desired, to be valued, to be loved for exactly who she was. "I have to go," she said reluctantly, though every cell in her body wanted to stay in this bubble of perfection forever. Greg helped her dress, his hands lingering on her skin like he was memorizing every touch. When he kissed her goodbye, it was with a tenderness that promised this wasn't ending, only beginning. "This doesn't have to be complicated," he said against her lips, "but it also doesn't have to be over." Barbara drove home through the quiet morning streets with her heart full of possibility and her mind spinning with the implications of what she'd done. She felt alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible, awakened in ways that went far beyond the physical. She arrived at her penthouse to find it exactly as she'd left it, cold, empty, and devoid of any evidence that a man who loved her lived there. Daxon's absence, which once would have hurt her, now felt like a gift. She had time to shower, time to change, time to process what had happened without having to face the man who had driven her into another man's arms. As she stood under the hot spray of water, washing away the evidence of her night with Greg, Barbara made herself a promise. She wouldn't feel guilty for taking one night of happiness. She wouldn't apologize for being a woman with needs and desires that her husband had abandoned years ago, but she also wouldn't fool herself into thinking this could continue without consequences. The reality of her situation hit her like a cold wind as she stepped out of the shower. She was a married woman who had just committed adultery with her boss. A married woman who was falling in love with a man who wasn't her husband. A married woman who had opened a door that could never be closed again. Barbara wrapped herself in a plush robe and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had left for the gala the night before. This woman's eyes held secrets, her skin glowed with satisfaction, and her smile carried the kind of confidence that came from being thoroughly and completely desired. This was the woman she was meant to be, Barbara realized with startling clarity. Not the desperately hopeful wife clinging to a marriage that had been dead for years, but a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to reach for happiness when it was offered. The sound of the front door opening downstairs made her freeze. Daxon was home, probably expecting to find her still asleep, unaware that his wife had spent the night discovering what real passion felt like. Barbara took a deep breath and prepared to face her husband, knowing that everything between them had changed irrevocably. She wasn't the same woman who had waited for him to come home anymore. She was a woman who had finally remembered what it felt like to be truly alive. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Foundation. Truth has a way of demanding to be heard. Guilt, Barbara discovered, was a luxury she could no longer afford, not when the truth was finally demanding its due. She stood at her kitchen window 3 days after the gala, watching Daxon stumble to his car with the practiced coordination of a functional alcoholic. His explanation for where he'd spent Friday night, crashed at the office too tired to drive, had been delivered with the same casual indifference he reserved for discussions about the weather or stock market fluctuations. Barbara had simply nodded and poured his coffee, playing the role of dutiful wife while her mind replayed every moment of her night with Greg. The contrast was staggering. Daxon's touch, when it came at all, was perfunctory and cold, while Greg had worshipped her body like it was something sacred. Daxon spoke to her in sentences designed to end conversation, while Greg had listened to her thoughts as if they were poetry worth memorizing. The sound of Daxon's Porsche disappearing down their street snapped Barbara back to the present. She had 30 minutes before she needed to leave for work. 30 minutes to search through her husband's belongings for evidence of what she already knew in her heart. She found it in his home office, tucked inside a leather portfolio he thought she'd never touch. Credit card statements dating back 6 months painted a picture so clear it took her breath away. Charges at intimate restaurants on nights he'd claimed to be working late. hotel bills for weekend trips she'd never been invited on, and most damning of all, recurring payments to something called BA Styling Services, $500 every 2 weeks, like clockwork. Barbara stared at the statements until the numbers blurred together, feeling something cold and analytical settle over her. The hurt was still there, sharp and persistent, but it was being overtaken by something far more dangerous: calculation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Skylar Beaumont, her best friend since college, and one of the city's most ruthless divorce attorneys. "Coffee after work? You've been avoiding me, and I'm starting to take it personally." Barbara smiled grimly as she typed her response. "Can you meet for lunch instead? I need to ask you something professional." Oh, that doesn't sound good. Noon at Meridian." "Perfect. And Skylar, bring your legal pad." The drive to Chaffee Industries felt different now, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm clouds gathering over the city. Barbara caught herself checking her reflection in the rearview mirror more carefully than usual, wondering if anyone would be able to tell that she was a woman who had been thoroughly and completely loved just 3 nights ago. The elevator ride to the 40th floor seemed to take forever. When the doors finally opened, Barbara's pulse quickened at the possibility of seeing Greg, even as her rational mind warned her that mixing business with pleasure was a recipe for disaster. She made it to her office without encountering him, but that didn't stop her from being hyper-aware of every sound in the hallway, every footstep that might belong to the man who had shown her what passion actually felt like. Mrs. Ravencrest. Her assistant Jennifer appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup of coffee and a carefully neutral expression. "Mr. Chaffee asked if you could stop by his office when you have a moment. He said it wasn't urgent." Barbara's heart performed an intricate dance against her ribs. Did he say what it was regarding? "The Morrison account, I believe." Of course. Business. That's all this was, all it could be. Barbara straightened her shoulders and headed toward the executive floor, trying to ignore the way her body hummed with anticipation. Greg's assistant waved her through to his office, where she found him standing at his wall of windows, hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the city below. He was wearing a navy suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, and Barbara had to forcibly remind herself that she was here for a business meeting, not to relive their night together. "You wanted to see me about the Morrison account?" she said, proud of how professional she sounded. Greg turned, and the moment their eyes met, Barbara felt the careful composure she'd built crumble. His dark gaze held the same intensity she remembered from the hotel suite, the same hunger that had made her feel like the most desirable woman alive. "Close the door," he said quietly. Barbara hesitated for a moment before complying, acutely aware that they were now alone together for the first time since that night. The office suddenly felt much smaller, the air between them crackling with unresolved tension. "There is no Morrison account issue," Greg said, moving closer but stopping a careful distance away. "I needed to see you, to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine," Barbara replied automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. I'm confused and guilty and exhilarated and terrified all at the same time." Greg's expression softened. "Regrets?" Barbara considered the question seriously. Did she regret the most passionate night of her life? Did she regret feeling desired and cherished for the first time in years? Did she regret discovering that she was capable of inspiring the kind of reverent hunger she'd seen in Greg's eyes? About Friday night? No, she said honestly. About what it means for everything else in my life? I don't know yet. "Barbara, please don't," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't make this more complicated than it already is. Don't make promises or declarations or tell me how you feel, because I can't handle that right now." Greg studied her face for a long moment, and Barbara could see him making the same calculation she was, weighing desire against discretion, passion against practicality. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. The question was so simple, so devoid of pressure or expectation, that Barbara felt tears threaten. When was the last time someone had asked what she needed, rather than assuming they knew? Time, she said. I need time to figure out what my life actually is before I can decide what I want it to become. Greg nodded, but she could see the disappointment he was trying to hide. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we're professionals who work together and nothing more. Even as she said it, Barbara knew it was a lie. You couldn't go back to being strangers with someone who had seen you fall apart in their arms. Understood, Greg said, but his eyes told a different story. Though for what it's worth, you deserve so much better than whatever situation is making you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Barbara left his office with her heart pounding and her resolve shaking. She made it through the rest of the morning by throwing herself into work with single-minded determination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in two different worlds. The professional facade she presented to her colleagues and the emotional turmoil that threatened to consume her from within. Lunch with Skylar was exactly what she needed. Her friend took one look at her across the table at Meridian and immediately went into attorney mode. "All right, what's going on?" Skylar demanded, pulling out her legal pad with the efficiency of someone who'd had this conversation before. "And don't try to tell me this is about some minor legal question. You look like a woman who's about to blow up her life." Barbara took a sip of her wine, something she never did at lunch, but today felt like it required liquid courage, and tried to figure out where to begin. "Hypothetically speaking," she said carefully, "what would someone need to prove adultery in a divorce case?" Skylar's pen stopped moving. "Hypothetically speaking, or are we talking about your marriage to Daxon?" "Hypothetically." "Barbara, we've been friends for 15 years. I can tell when you're lying, and I can definitely tell when you're planning something that's going to change your life forever." Skylar leaned forward, her expression serious. "What did you find?" Barbara pulled out her phone and showed Skylar the photos she'd taken of Daxon's credit card statements. Her friend's eyebrows climbed higher with each image. "Jesus, Barbara, how long has this been going on?" "At least 6 months, based on what I found." "Probably longer." Barbara took another sip of wine, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "The question is, what do I do about it?" "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" Skylar corrected. "Because I can tell you right now that these statements, combined with some basic investigation, would be more than enough to prove infidelity in divorce proceedings." "Investigation?" Skylar pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I know a private investigator who specializes in domestic cases. Expensive, but worth every penny. If Daxon is having an affair, Marcus will get you photos, documentation, the works." Barbara stared at her friend, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. Once she hired a private investigator, there would be no going back to ignorance. No more pretending that her marriage might somehow be salvaged. "How long would it take?" she heard herself asking. "For someone as careless as your husband appears to be, a week, maybe 2. Skylar reached across the table and squeezed Barbara's hand. "But before you make this decision, I need to ask, are you sure this is what you want? Because once we go down this road, once we start gathering evidence, you can't unknow what we're going to find." Barbara thought about Daxon's cold dismissal of their anniversary, about his casual cruelty when she'd tried to talk about their future, about the way he looked through her like she was invisible. Then she thought about Greg's gentle reverence, about feeling desired and cherished and truly seen for the first time in years. "I'm sure," she said, and meant it. Skylar made the call right there at the table, scheduling a meeting with Marcus for that evening. As Barbara listened to her friend arrange for the systematic documentation of her husband's infidelity, she felt something shift inside her chest. The desperate, hopeful wife who had been clinging to a dead marriage was finally stepping aside to make room for the woman who was ready to fight for her own happiness. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of meetings and phone calls, but Barbara's mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning with a clarity that surprised her. She was done being a victim of Daxon's indifference. She was done making excuses for a man who had shown her nothing but contempt. She was ready to take control of her own destiny. The meeting with Marcus Holloway took place in Skylar's law office after hours. The private investigator was exactly what Barbara had expected: mid-50s, unremarkable appearance, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from having seen every possible variation of human betrayal. "I'll need some basic information," Marcus said, pulling out a tablet. "Work schedule, usual haunts, vehicle information. The more details you can provide, the faster I can get you results." Barbara answered his questions with mechanical precision, providing dates and times and locations with the thoroughness of someone who had been unconsciously cataloging her husband's lies for months. When Marcus asked if she had any idea who the other woman might be, Barbara hesitated. "There are charges to something called BA styling services," she said finally. "I don't know what that is." Marcus made a note. "I'll look into it. Anything else? Any suspicious behavior, unexplained absences, changes in routine?" Barbara thought about the empty bottles hidden throughout their penthouse, about Daxon's increasing irritability and distance, about the way he seemed to be deliberately pushing her away. "He's been drinking more," she said. "A lot more. And he's been staying out later, coming home drunk or not at all." "Substance abuse often goes hand in hand with infidelity," Marcus observed matter-of-factly. "Guilt manifests in different ways for different people." The idea that Daxon might feel guilty about his affair was almost laughable. Barbara couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him display genuine emotion about anything, much less remorse for hurting her. "How long before you have something?" Schuyler asked. "Given what Mrs. Ravencrest has told me, I'd say a week at most. Men who are this careless usually aren't trying very hard to hide their activities." Marcus closed his tablet and stood. "I'll be in touch as soon as I have something concrete." Barbara drove home through the evening traffic with her mind spinning. In a week, she would have proof of what she already knew. In a week, she would have the ammunition she needed to end her marriage and start building a new life. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like freedom. She arrived at the penthouse to find Daxon exactly where she'd expected, in his study, drunk and sullen, staring at his computer screen with the glassy-eyed focus of someone who was trying to function despite being 3 sheets to the wind. "How was your day?" Barbara asked from the doorway, testing the words for any trace of the desperate hope that used to color every interaction with her husband. There was none. She was simply going through the motions now, playing her part while she waited for the evidence that would set her free. "Fine," Daxon mumbled without looking up from his screen. Barbara nodded and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I'll be traveling next week," he said, still not looking at her. "Business trip to Chicago. I'll be gone Thursday through Sunday." "Of course you will," Barbara thought, but aloud she simply said, "I'll make sure Maria doesn't plan any meals for you." As she headed upstairs to their bedroom, their cold, loveless bedroom where they slept like strangers sharing space rather than spouses sharing a life, Barbara smiled for the first time all day. Next week, while Daxon was in Chicago with his mystery woman, Marcus would be documenting every moment of their affair, and Barbara would finally have the proof she needed to end this farce of a marriage once and for all. She was done being the woman who waited for a man who would never come home to her heart. It was time to become the woman who was brave enough to build a life worth living. Chapter 5. The photographs that ignite fury. Sometimes seeing is believing, and rage is born. Betrayal, Barbara learned, had a very specific weight, heavy enough to crush what remained of your heart, but light enough to fuel the fire that would burn down everything you thought you knew about love. She stared at the manila envelope Marcus had placed on the cafe table between them, her hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. 5 days. It had taken the private investigator exactly 5 days to document 3 years' worth of lies with the clinical precision of a surgeon dissecting a corpse. "Are you sure you want to see these?" Marcus asked, his weathered face showing the kind of compassion that came from watching too many lives implode. "Sometimes knowing the details makes it harder to move forward." Barbara's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Moving forward is exactly what I plan to do. But first, I need to know exactly what I'm moving forward from." She opened the envelope with the same steady hands that had signed her marriage certificate 3 years ago, when she'd believed that love could conquer anything and that faithfulness was a given rather than a gift. The first photograph hit her like a physical blow. Daxon entering an upscale hotel with a woman who definitely wasn't his wife. Brielle Ashford. Even in the grainy surveillance photo, she was stunning. 26 years old with platinum blonde hair, legs that went on for miles, and the kind of Instagram-perfect face that launched 1,000 brand partnerships. Barbara recognized her immediately from her social media presence, at Brielle Styles U, with 2.3 million followers and a lifestyle that screamed expensive tastes and daddy issues. "BA Styling Services," Barbara said quietly, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "That's her business. He's been paying her for styling services." "Among other things," Marcus said grimly, sliding another photograph across the table. This one showed Daxon and Brielle at the very restaurant where Barbara had found the receipt, Chez Laurent, where they sat at an intimate corner table, Daxon's hand covering Brielle's in the candlelight. But it wasn't the romantic setting that made Barbara's vision blur with rage. It was the expression on her husband's face. He looked alive, alert, engaged. The man in the photograph was laughing at something Brielle had said, his eyes bright with an animation Barbara hadn't seen directed at her in over a year. This wasn't the drunk, sullen stranger who came home to their penthouse every night. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, charming, attentive, completely present. He'd just never been that man with her. "How long?" Barbara asked, her voice eerily calm. "Based on the financial records and what I was able to observe, at least 8 months. Possibly longer." Marcus pulled out more photographs, arranging them like tarot cards, revealing an increasingly devastating future. "They have a routine. Thursday evenings at various high-end restaurants, weekends at the Ritz-Carlton suite he keeps under his company's name, shopping trips where he buys her jewelry and clothes." Barbara studied each photograph with the detached focus of a general reviewing battle plans. Here was Daxon helping Brielle into his Porsche, his hand gentle on her back. Here they were entering Tiffany and Company, where he'd purchased the $2,800 item that had never found its way to his wife. Here was Brielle wearing a diamond bracelet Barbara had never seen, laughing at something Daxon whispered in her ear. "The most damning evidence is from this past weekend," Marcus continued, sliding a final set of photos across the table. "While you believed he was on a business trip to Chicago, he and Ms. Ashford spent 3 days at a resort in Napa Valley." The photographs from Napa were like looking into an alternate universe where Daxon Ravencrest was capable of love. He and Brielle walked hand in hand through vineyards, shared intimate dinners on private terraces, and lounged by the pool like honeymooners. In one particularly crushing image, Daxon was photographing Brielle as she posed among the grapevines, both of them laughing with the kind of easy intimacy that Barbara had spent 3 years trying to recreate. "He's sober in all of these," Barbara observed, her voice still carrying that unnatural calm that Marcus had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Every single one," Marcus confirmed. Whatever demons drive him to drink, they apparently don't surface when he's with her. The implications hit Barbara like an avalanche. Daxon's drinking wasn't a disease or an addiction he couldn't control. It was a choice. He chose to numb himself when he was with his wife. He chose to be present when he was with his mistress. He chose to be cold and distant with the woman who had pledged her life to him, while lavishing attention and affection on someone who owed him nothing but the services he paid for. "There's one more thing," Marcus said carefully, producing a final photograph that made Barbara's carefully maintained composure crack. "This was taken last night." The image showed Daxon and Brielle in what was clearly her apartment, a sleek, modern space that Instagram staging had made famous among her followers. They were cooking dinner together, Brielle in one of Daxon's dress shirts, and nothing else, while he stood behind her at the stove, his arms wrapped around her waist and his face buried in her neck. It was the picture of domestic bliss that Barbara had dreamed of having with her own husband. "Son of a bitch," Barbara whispered, and Marcus was surprised to hear admiration rather than devastation in her voice. "Mrs. Ravencrest?" Barbara looked up from the photographs, her dark eyes blazing with an intensity that made Marcus instinctively lean back. "Do you know what the most insulting part of all this is? It's not that he's having an affair. It's not even that he's in love with her. It's that he's been lying to my face about who he is." She gathered the photographs with sharp, efficient movements, her mind already calculating possibilities and consequences. "For 3 years I've been trying to save a marriage to a man who doesn't exist. The drunk, cold, distant husband? That's a performance. This," she tapped the photo of Daxon cooking with Brielle, "this is who he really is, and he's been hiding that man from me deliberately." Marcus watched her transform before his eyes. The hurt wife was dissolving, replaced by something far more dangerous, a woman who had finally understood the true scope of her husband's betrayal and was ready to respond accordingly. "What do you want to do with this information?" he asked. Barbara's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "I want to destroy him, completely. But first I want him to know that I know. I want him to understand that his carefully constructed double life is about to collapse around his ears. And after that, I want him to pay for every lie, every cruel word, every night he came home drunk rather than admit he was capable of being the man I needed him to be." Barbara's voice was soft, but Marcus had worked with enough vengeful spouses to recognize the tone of someone who had moved far beyond hurt into the realm of calculated retribution. "Mrs. Ravencrest, I feel compelled to remind you that revenge is a dish best served through legal channels." "Oh, I'm not talking about anything illegal," Barbara interrupted, her smile widening. "I'm talking about something much more sophisticated than that. I'm talking about using his own weaknesses against him. His drinking, his arrogance, his assumption that I'm too stupid and too desperate to figure out what he's been doing." She stood up, sliding the photographs into her purse with the care of someone handling precious artifacts. "Marcus, I need you to continue surveillance for another week. I want documentation of every meeting, every phone call, every moment they spend together. Can you do that?" "Of course, but may I ask why?" Barbara's laugh was like ice cracking. "Because when I confront my husband about his affair, I want him to know that I have evidence of every single lie he's told me. I want him to understand that while he thought he was playing me for a fool, I was gathering ammunition for war." She paid Marcus in cash and walked out of the cafe with the purposeful stride of a woman who had finally found her true calling. The hurt wife who had spent months making excuses for her husband's behavior was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't getting mad. It was getting even. The drive back to her office gave Barbara time to think, to plan, to consider her options with the cold calculation of a chess master contemplating her next move. Daxon thought he was so clever, maintaining his double life with the arrogance of a man who believed his wife was too weak and too dependent to challenge him. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Barbara arrived at Chaffee Industries with a new sense of purpose, her mind already working through the delicious possibilities that Marcus's photographs had opened up. She had evidence of Daxon's infidelity that would hold up in any courtroom. She had documentation of his lies, his financial infidelity, his complete disregard for his marriage vows. More importantly, she had something even more valuable, the knowledge that she wasn't the problem. For 3 years, she'd blamed herself for her marriage's failure, convinced that if she could just be more patient, more understanding, more appealing, she could win back her husband's love. Now she knew the truth. Daxon was perfectly capable of love, affection, and presence. He simply chose not to offer those things to his wife. The realization was simultaneously devastating and liberating. "Mrs. Ravencrest?" Jennifer appeared in her office doorway, looking concerned. "Mr. Chaffee was looking for you earlier. He said it wasn't urgent, but that he'd like to see you when you have a moment." Barbara's pulse quickened at the mention of Greg's name, but she forced herself to maintain professional composure. "Did he say what it was regarding?" "The quarterly budget review, I believe." Barbara nodded, trying to ignore the way her body responded to the thought of seeing Greg again. The night they'd spent together felt like it had happened in another lifetime, to another version of herself. The woman who had fallen apart in Greg's arms had been desperate and broken, seeking comfort from the pain of her marriage. The woman she was now had moved far beyond seeking comfort. She was ready to take action. She found Greg in his office, standing at his wall of windows with his hands clasped behind his back. The same position she'd found him in the last time they'd spoken privately. But today, his posture seemed different somehow, more tense, as if he were wrestling with thoughts that refused to be controlled. "You wanted to see me," Barbara said from the doorway. Greg turned, and the moment their eyes met, Barbara saw her own transformation reflected in his gaze. Where once she'd seen concern and gentle protectiveness, now she saw something harder, more predatory. Greg Chaffee was a man who'd built an empire through intelligence and ruthless efficiency, and he was looking at her now like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Close the door," he said, echoing their last private conversation. Barbara complied, acutely aware that the dynamic between them had shifted in ways she was only beginning to understand. The vulnerable woman who had needed rescuing was gone, replaced by someone who was very much in control of her own destiny. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," Greg said, moving closer but maintaining that careful distance that spoke of a man who was fighting his own instincts. "About what you said you needed." "Time," Barbara said. "I said I needed time. Have you had enough?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Barbara studied Greg's face, seeing past the professional mask to the man underneath. The man who had held her while she cried, who had made love to her like she was precious, who had shown her what it felt like to be truly wanted. "Yes," she said simply, "I've had enough time to realize that some situations can't be fixed, only ended." Greg's eyes sharpened with interest. "What does that mean?" Barbara pulled out her phone and showed him one of Marcus's photographs, the image of Daxon and Brielle at Chez Laurent, lost in their private world of romance and deception. "It means," Barbara said, watching Greg's expression darken as he processed what he was seeing, "that my marriage has been over for much longer than I was willing to admit. It also means that I'm done being the victim in my own life story." Greg handed her phone back, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "How long has this been going on? At least 8 months, possibly longer." Barbara's voice was steady, matter of fact. "He's been living a completely separate life with her while treating me like an inconvenience he has to tolerate." "Barbara, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Barbara interrupted, her eyes blazing with newfound determination. Be angry. Because I am absolutely furious, and I'm about to do something about it. Greg studied her face, and Barbara could see the exact moment when he recognized that the woman standing before him was not the same person who had sought comfort in his arms. This woman was dangerous in all the best ways, intelligent, determined, and ready to fight for what she wanted. "What are you planning?" he asked. Barbara's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "I'm planning to give my husband exactly what he deserves, and then I'm planning to build a life worth living." She turned to leave, but Greg's voice stopped her at the door. "Barbara." She looked back at him, seeing heat and admiration, and something that looked suspiciously like pride in his dark eyes. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Somewhere public where I can show you off properly." Barbara's smile softened into something genuine and warm. "I'd like that too." As she left Greg's office and returned to her own, Barbara felt the final pieces of her plan clicking into place. She had the evidence she needed to destroy Daxon's carefully constructed lies. She had the support of the best divorce attorney in the city, and she had the promise of something real and beautiful waiting for her on the other side of the war she was about to wage. It was time to stop being the woman who waited for a man who would never choose her. It was time to become the woman who was brave enough to choose herself. Chapter 6. The Strategic Mind Awakens. When a woman decides to fight back, hell hath no fury. Sometimes the universe delivers exactly the weapon you need at precisely the moment you're ready to use it, and sometimes that weapon comes wrapped in the most unexpected package imaginable. Barbara had been planning Daxon's destruction for 3 days when her body decided to betray her. It started with nausea during Tuesday's staff meeting, forcing her to excuse herself to the ladies' room, where she fought the urge to vomit. She blamed it on stress. The past week had been controlled fury as she'd cataloged Marcus's photographs and constructed a timeline of deception. The emotional toll was bound to manifest physically, but when the nausea returned Wednesday with bone-deep fatigue, Barbara began to suspect something more. Thursday brought dizziness so severe she had to grip the bathroom counter. Her period was late, and combined with other symptoms, a terrifying possibility took shape. "No," she whispered to her reflection. "Not now." But Barbara was counting days, remembering the night in Greg's arms with clarity that made her knees weak. They'd been careful, but not careful enough. Friday morning found Barbara in Dr. Thorne's office, trying to convince herself she was overreacting. "I've been feeling unwell," Barbara said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Nausea, fatigue, dizziness. I'm sure it's just stress." When Dr. Thorne suggested a pregnancy test, just to be thorough, Barbara's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm sure that's not necessary," Barbara said quickly. "My husband and I haven't been trying to conceive." "Sometimes these things happen, regardless of our plans, dear." 20 minutes later, Barbara sat staring at a magazine, her mind racing through scenarios that made her feel elated and terrified. "Congratulations, Doctor," Thorne said with a warm smile. "You're pregnant, about 6 weeks along." The words hit Barbara like a physical blow. 6 weeks, exactly 6 weeks since the night she'd fallen apart in Greg's arms. "Are you certain?" Barbara whispered. "Absolutely. The blood test is definitive." Dr. Thorne leaned forward, concerned. "How are you feeling about this news?" Barbara stared without really seeing, her mind spinning with computer-like speed. She was carrying Greg's child while married to a man who had spent months lavishing love on his mistress. And then, like lightning striking, a thought so brilliant it took her breath away. Daxon wouldn't know the baby wasn't his. Her husband's drinking had reached the point where entire evenings disappeared into blackouts. He rarely touched her, but when drunk enough, there had been a few fumbling encounters. Encounters Barbara had endured rather than enjoyed, but encounters nonetheless. Daxon would remember some of them. In his alcohol-hazed mind, he would assume he'd forgotten others. "Mrs. Ravencrest?" Dr. Thorne's voice seemed far away. "Are you all right?" Barbara looked up, and the smile that spread across her face was sharp as glass. "I'm perfect. This is absolutely perfect." Dr. Thorne looked concerned by the intensity of Barbara's reaction. "Would you like me to schedule a follow-up appointment?" "Yes," Barbara said, standing with newfound energy. "Schedule everything. I want this pregnancy to be as healthy and well-documented as possible." She left the doctor's office with prenatal vitamins and a strategic plan so elegant it almost made her laugh. Just when she'd been wondering how to inflict maximum psychological damage on her cheating husband, fate had handed her the perfect weapon. Barbara found Daxon in his study, already 3 drinks into his evening routine, staring at his computer with glassy focus. Perfect. The drunker he was, the more confused he would be about his memories. Barbara stood in the doorway, studying the man she'd married with clinical detachment. Even drunk and disheveled, Daxon was handsome, but his beauty masked an ugly soul. "Daxon," she said sweetly, "we need to talk." He looked up, steel-gray eyes struggling to focus. "What about something wonderful?" Barbara moved closer, allowing excitement to color her voice. "Something that's going to change everything for us." Daxon's expression shifted to wariness. In his alcohol-addled state, he was probably wondering if she'd found out about Brielle. "I went to the doctor today," Barbara continued, settling across from his desk. "I've been feeling unwell lately." "And?" Daxon's voice was carefully neutral. Barbara let the silence build suspense, watching her husband's growing anxiety with satisfaction. "I'm pregnant," she said, and watched Daxon's world explode. The crystal tumbler slipped from his fingers, crashing to the floor in a shower of glass and whiskey. Daxon stared at her with complete shock. "What did you say?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm pregnant," Barbara repeated, allowing wonder and joy to fill her voice. "We're going to have a baby, Daxon. After all this time, we're finally going to be a family." She watched him struggle to process the information, his alcohol-soaked brain trying to make sense of timing and possibilities. This was the moment of truth. Would he remember their sporadic encounters clearly enough to accept paternity? But how? Daxon stammered. "We haven't. I mean, it's been..." "It's been what?" Barbara asked innocently. "Daxon, I know we haven't been as intimate lately, but it only takes once. Don't you remember last month? After your company party, you came home drunk and we..." She let her voice trail off, painting her cheeks with a blush. "You were so sweet that night." She was making it up entirely, but she could see Daxon grasping for the memory, trying to sort through alcohol-blurred evenings. I don't remember," Daxon began. "You were drinking," Barbara said gently, as if helping him piece together a pleasant memory. "You said you loved me. You said you wanted a real marriage again." Her voice broke just enough to sound genuine. Daxon's face went through expressions: confusion, fear, guilt, and finally, reluctant acceptance. He wanted to deny it, but couldn't be certain enough to risk it. 6 weeks, Barbara continued. "The doctor said I'm 6 weeks along. That would make it right around your company party, wouldn't it?" She watched Daxon do the math, watched him realize that denying paternity would mean admitting he wasn't sure what he'd done during blackouts. Yes, he said finally, his voice hollow. "The company party was 6 weeks ago." Barbara felt triumph so intense it was almost sexual. She'd done it. She'd planted doubt about his memories, forced him to accept responsibility for a child that wasn't his. "I know this is unexpected," she said, moving to kneel beside his chair. "But maybe this is exactly what we need. Maybe this baby is a sign. Daxon stared at her with horror. Barbara, this isn't a good time. My career, everything is complicated. Every time is complicated until you decide to make it simple, Barbara said softly, taking his hands and feeling nothing but cold calculation. This baby is a gift, Daxon. She could see him struggling, wanting to reject everything but not sure enough to risk confrontation. What do you want me to say? Daxon asked finally, defeated. I want you to say you're happy, Barbara replied hopefully. I want you to say you still love me enough to build a life with our child. The silence stretched. Barbara could see Daxon's mind racing through options. Of course, he said finally, the words dragged from his throat. Of course I'm happy about the baby. Barbara smiled and kissed his cheek, tasting whiskey and desperation. I love you, she whispered and felt him flinch. As she pulled back, Barbara saw fear in Daxon's eyes. He was afraid of what this pregnancy meant for his double life, afraid of complications about to rain down. Good. Let him be afraid. I should schedule our first appointment together, Barbara said, standing. You'll want to be there for the ultrasound, won't you? Yes, Daxon said automatically, though he looked like he'd rather schedule his execution. Barbara left her husband surrounded by broken glass and wreckage. As she climbed the stairs, she allowed herself a smile of pure triumph. Phase 1 was complete. Daxon now believed he was the father, which meant he was trapped by his own guilt and confusion. He couldn't leave her for Brielle without abandoning his pregnant wife, and he couldn't deny paternity without admitting to blackouts. But tonight, Barbara was going to call Greg and share the news that would change both their lives forever. While Daxon thought he was trapped by fatherhood, Greg was about to discover he was finally free to claim the family he'd never known he wanted. Sometimes revenge was a dish best served with perfect timing. Chapter 7. The performance begins. When revenge requires the greatest acting of your life. The art of psychological warfare, Barbara discovered, required the same skills as method acting. You had to believe your own performance so completely that even you forgot where the truth ended and the beautiful lie began. 3 weeks into her pregnancy deception, Barbara had perfected the role of glowing, expectant mother with an Oscar-worthy precision that would have impressed even the most demanding drama coach. She'd purchased prenatal vitamins and left them conspicuously on the kitchen counter where Daxon couldn't miss them. She'd started declining wine at business dinners, placing her hand protectively over her still flat stomach, with the reverent touch of a woman nurturing new life. She'd even begun leaving pregnancy books around their penthouse, dog-eared and highlighted like she was studying for the most important exam of her life. The performance was flawless, but it was the psychological torture that made it truly artistic. Good morning, Daddy, Barbara said cheerfully as Daxon stumbled into the kitchen on Tuesday morning, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot from another night of trying to drink away the complications his life had suddenly acquired. Daxon flinched at the word Daddy, like she'd struck him with a cattle prod. Over the past 3 weeks, Barbara had watched her husband deteriorate with the satisfaction of a scientist observing a particularly successful experiment. The man who had once been so confident in his ability to compartmentalize his life was now jumping at shadows, paranoid and increasingly erratic, as he tried to figure out how to explain a pregnant wife to his mistress. Coffee? Barbara asked sweetly, though she already knew he'd refuse. Daxon had been avoiding their kitchen entirely lately, preferring to grab his caffeine from whatever establishment allowed him to drink in peace without his wife's cheerful commentary about their blessed event. I'm late for work, Daxon muttered, not meeting her eyes. Of course you are, but before you go... Barbara moved closer, placing her hand on his arm with the gentle touch of a devoted wife. I scheduled our first ultrasound appointment for Thursday at 2. Dr. Thorne says we should be able to hear the heartbeat by then. She felt Daxon's muscles tense under her touch, watched the color drain from his face as the implications hit him. An ultrasound meant dates. Dates meant timelines. Timelines meant the possibility of medical professionals asking questions about conception that might not align with his alcohol-hazed memories. Thursday. His voice cracked slightly. I have meetings all day Thursday. I'm sure you can reschedule, Barbara said with the kind of gentle insistence that brooked no argument. This is our baby's first official photograph, Daxon. You wouldn't want to miss something so important, would you? Daxon stared at her with an expression that was equal parts terror and rage, and Barbara had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. Her husband was a man who prided himself on control, on his ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. Watching him realize that he was now completely at the mercy of circumstances he couldn't control was more satisfying than any physical revenge could have been. Fine, he said finally. I'll be there. Perfect. Barbara rose on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek, breathing in the scent of expensive aftershave that couldn't quite mask the underlying smell of whiskey and desperation. I love you so much, Daxon, and I love that we're finally going to be a real family. She felt him shudder at her words, watched him struggle with the weight of obligations he'd never wanted and responsibilities he couldn't escape. When he left for work without saying goodbye, Barbara poured herself a cup of coffee and allowed herself a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The beauty of her plan was its elegant simplicity. Daxon couldn't deny paternity without admitting to the kind of blackout drinking that would raise questions about his professional competence. He couldn't confess the affair without revealing the extent of his deception and financial infidelity. And he couldn't abandon his pregnant wife without looking like the kind of monster that even his social circle wouldn't tolerate. He was trapped, and they both knew it. Barbara's phone buzzed with a text from Greg. How are you feeling this morning? And how did the performance go? She told Greg about the pregnancy and her strategic use of it as a weapon against Daxon 3 days ago, during a private dinner at his penthouse that had been equal parts business strategy session and intimate revelation. Greg's reaction to learning he was going to be a father had been everything Barbara had hoped for and more. Wonder, protective tenderness, and a fierce determination to claim his family the moment she was free to give it to him. Flawless as always, Barbara typed back. He looks like he's aged 5 years in 3 weeks. Good. And the doctor's appointment? Thursday at 2. I'm going to insist he be there for the ultrasound. Should be interesting to watch him try to explain why he's so uncomfortable. I hate that you're going through this alone. Barbara stared at Greg's message, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with pregnancy hormones and everything to do with being cherished by a man who saw her worth. The contrast between Greg's protective concern and Daxon's cold indifference was so stark it was almost laughable. I'm not alone, she replied. I have you, and after this is over, we'll have forever. I love you. The words appeared on her screen like a benediction, and Barbara felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks. Not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of gratitude for finally finding a man who could love her exactly as she was, brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely determined to protect what mattered to her. I love you too, she typed back. More than I ever thought possible. The rest of Tuesday passed in a haze of productive plotting. Barbara had lunch with Skylar, who was putting the finishing touches on divorce papers that would strip Daxon of everything he'd worked to build, while ensuring Barbara emerged from their marriage with enough resources to start her new life in comfort. She spent the afternoon at work, maintaining her professional facade while fielding concerned questions from colleagues who'd noticed her husband's increasingly erratic behavior at recent company functions. Is Daxon all right? Jennifer asked during their weekly status meeting. He seemed quite agitated at the Morrison account presentation last week. He's been under a lot of stress lately. Barbara replied smoothly. Big changes coming in our personal life. You know how men get when their carefully ordered world starts shifting. It wasn't even a lie, technically. Daxon's world was definitely shifting, right off its axis and into a tailspin that would make a fighter pilot nauseous. Wednesday brought its own entertainment in the form of a panicked phone call from Daxon at 11 in the morning. "We need to talk," he said without preamble when Barbara answered her phone. "Of course, darling. What about—" "Not over the phone. Meet me for lunch, chez Laurent, 12h30. Barbara's smile could have powered a small city. Chez Laurent, the same restaurant where Daxon had taken Brielle for their romantic dinners, where Marcus had photographed them lost in their private world of deception and desire. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. "That sounds lovely," Barbara said. "Though I should warn you, I've been having some morning sickness. Well, all-day sickness, really. I might not be the best lunch companion." She heard Daxon's sharp intake of breath and knew her casual mention of pregnancy symptoms had hit its mark. Every reminder of her condition was another twist of the knife, another weight added to the guilt and confusion that were slowly driving him insane. "Just be there," he said, and hung up without saying goodbye. Barbara arrived at Chez Laurent 15 minutes early, requesting the same corner table where Daxon had wooed his mistress, while his wife sat home alone, wondering why her marriage felt like a beautiful prison. She ordered sparkling water with lime and studied the menu with the serene expression of a woman who held all the cards and was about to play them. Daxon arrived looking like he'd aged a decade in the past month. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his steel-gray eyes held the wild look of a man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. He slid into the chair across from her with the defeated posture of someone who'd realized that all his careful plans were crumbling around his ears. "You look tired," Barbara observed with gentle concern. "Are you sleeping all right?" "Cut the act, Barbara," Daxon said, his voice low and dangerous. "We both know what this is really about." Barbara blinked at him with perfectly innocent confusion. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. What is what really about?" "The pregnancy. The sudden transformation from neglected wife to devoted mother-to-be. The way you're watching me like you're waiting for something." Daxon leaned forward, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What game are you playing?" "Game?" Barbara's voice rose just enough to catch the attention of nearby diners, forcing Daxon to lower his own voice. "Daxon, I'm talking about our baby, about the family we're going to build together. I don't understand why you're being so hostile about something that should be making us both happy." She watched him struggle with her refusal to drop the innocent act, watched his paranoia and guilt war with his inability to pinpoint exactly what was wrong. The beauty of gaslighting someone who was already lying to themselves was that they couldn't trust their own instincts about what was real and what wasn't. "Barbara, listen to me very carefully," Daxon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you think you have this all figured out, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. If you're trying to trap me—" "Trap you?" Barbara's eyes filled with tears that were only half feigned. "Daxon, you're the father of my child. We're married. We're supposed to be building a life together. How is that trapping you?" The tears did exactly what she'd hoped they would, made Daxon look like a monster in the eyes of the other restaurant patrons who were now openly staring at their table. A man berating his pregnant wife in public was not a good look for someone who depended on his reputation for professional success. "That's not what I meant," Daxon said quickly, glancing around at their audience. This is all happening very fast and I need time to process." 6 weeks, Daxon," Barbara interrupted, her voice breaking with just the right amount of hurt and confusion. "I've been carrying your child for 6 weeks, and you're acting like it's some kind of inconvenience." Like I'm some kind of problem you need to solve. She stood up abruptly, playing the part of the wounded wife to perfection. I thought you'd be happy. I thought this baby would bring us closer together. But if you can't even manage to pretend you want this family... She let her voice trail off, pressing her hand to her stomach in a gesture that was both protective and accusatory. Barbara, wait. No, she said, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. I won't subject our child to a father who sees them as a mistake. If you can't love this baby, then maybe I need to find someone who can. She swept out of the restaurant with the dramatic flair of a woman whose heart was breaking, leaving Daxon sitting alone at their table, while 30 pairs of eyes judged him for his treatment of his pregnant wife. Through the window she watched him signal frantically for the check, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. Barbara made it to her car before allowing herself to laugh out loud. The performance had been even better than she'd hoped, and she had no doubt that by evening, half of their social circle would have heard about Daxon Ravencrest's public humiliation of his expectant wife. Her phone rang as she was driving back to the office, Daxon's name flashing on the screen like a surrender flag. What do you want? She answered, allowing hurt and exhaustion to color her voice. Come home, Daxon said, and she could hear the defeat in his tone. Please, we need to talk properly. I don't think I'm ready for another conversation where you make me feel like a burden, Barbara replied. I'm pregnant, Daxon. I'm scared and emotional, and I need my husband to support me, not attack me in public restaurants. I know. I'm sorry. This is all overwhelming, and I'm not handling it well. The admission seemed to cost him something vital. Come home. Let me try to be the husband you need me to be. Barbara smiled at her reflection in the rearview mirror. I'll be home at 6, but Daxon, this is your last chance to prove you want this family, because if you can't step up and be the man I need you to be, I'm going to find someone who can. She hung up before he could respond, leaving him to sit with the implication that his pregnant wife might be entertaining thoughts of other men. The irony was delicious. While Daxon panicked about the possibility of Barbara leaving him for someone else, she was already building a life with the man who would be her real husband as soon as she was free to claim him. Thursday's ultrasound appointment would be the culmination of 3 weeks of psychological warfare. Barbara would watch Daxon struggle through the appointment, fighting his guilt and confusion while trying to play the part of excited father-to-be. She would see her baby's face for the first time, knowing that the child growing inside her was the product of real love rather than marital obligation. And then, when the moment was right, when Daxon was completely trapped by his own assumptions and the weight of social expectation, she would reveal the truth about everything. His affair, her knowledge of it, the real paternity of the child he'd been convinced was his. The look on his face when he realized that his wife had been playing chess while he'd been playing checkers would be worth every moment of the elaborate performance she'd been giving. Barbara Leslie Ravencrest was done being the victim in her own life story. It was time for the final act, and she was going to make sure it was a performance worthy of a standing ovation. Chapter 8. The revelation that changes everything. When the hunter becomes the hunted. The moment of truth, Barbara had learned, never arrived with trumpets and fanfare. It slipped in quietly through the back door while everyone was looking the other way, then exploded like a bomb in a cathedral. Thursday afternoon at Dr. Thorne's office had been psychological torture disguised as medical care. Barbara had watched Daxon squirm through every question about conception dates and prenatal care. By the time they heard their baby's heartbeat, strong and steady at 8 weeks, Daxon looked like a man facing execution. The ultrasound image sat on their coffee table like evidence in a trial, showing Greg's child growing inside Barbara's body, while her husband believed himself trapped by forgotten sins. We need to talk about telling people, Barbara said, as Daxon poured his 4th drink of the evening. My parents, your brother, our friends, It's getting harder to hide, and I'm so excited to share our news. Daxon's hand trembled slightly. Maybe we should wait until the second trimester. It's safer. Safer for whom? Barbara asked with innocent curiosity. For the baby or for you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Daxon's steel-gray eyes sharpened with something that might have been awareness or paranoia. What's that supposed to mean? Barbara rose from the sofa with fluid grace. It means, darling husband, that you've been acting like a man with something to hide ever since I told you about the pregnancy. Like a man afraid of being found out. Barbara? Found out about what, though? Barbara began pacing like a prosecutor addressing a jury. What could my devoted husband possibly have to hide about becoming a father? Daxon set down his drink carefully. You're being paranoid. Am I? Barbara pulled out her phone, swiping to Marcus's photographs. Because I think I'm being remarkably clear-sighted for the first time in 3 years. She showed Daxon the image of himself and Brielle at Chez Laurent, their faces glowing with intimacy and happiness he'd never shown his wife. The color drained from Daxon's face. He stared at the photograph like a man watching his world collapse. Where did you get that? The same place I got these, Barbara said, swiping through image after image of Daxon's double life. And these. And oh, this one is particularly interesting. Napa Valley last weekend while you were supposedly in Chicago on business. She watched her husband age 10 years in 10 seconds, watched the arrogant mask slip away to reveal the coward underneath. How long have you known? Daxon asked finally. Long enough to hire a private investigator. Long enough to document every lie. Long enough to realize that the man I married never existed. Barbara's voice was clinical, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. 8 months, Daxon. You've been living a separate life with Brielle Ashford while treating me like an inconvenience. Daxon stood up abruptly, swaying from alcohol and shock. Barbara, let me explain. Explain what? That you're capable of love and passion, just not with your wife. Barbara's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. That you can be sober and charming when you want to be, but you chose to be drunk and cruel with me. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. Barbara's composure finally cracked, 3 years of suppressed fury erupting. You made me believe I was the problem. You made me think I wasn't enough, wasn't interesting enough, wasn't woman enough to hold your attention. Daxon reached for his drink again, seeking liquid courage. Barbara, please, if you'll just listen. I'm done listening to your lies, Barbara interrupted, her dark eyes blazing. But I am curious about one thing. How exactly were you planning to explain a pregnant wife to your girlfriend? Were you going to tell Brielle it was an accident, a mistake, one last obligation before you could be free? The accuracy of her guess was written all over Daxon's face. You were, weren't you? She continued. You were going to string us both along, playing devoted father-to-be with me while promising Brielle this was just temporary. Before Daxon could respond, the elevator opened. Heavy footsteps approached their living room, and then Greg Chaffee appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel. His dark eyes took in the scene with sharp intelligence. Greg, Barbara said, her voice warming. Perfect timing. Daxon looked between his wife and her boss with dawning horror. What the hell is he doing here? Daxon demanded. He's here, Greg said, stepping into the room with predatory confidence. Because Barbara called me. Because she needed support while she confronted her lying, cheating husband. This is between my wife and me, Daxon said, puffing up with false bravado. Actually, Barbara said, her smile sharp as diamond, this concerns Greg quite directly. You see, darling husband, there's one more thing I haven't told you about this pregnancy. Daxon's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, suspicion, and finally, creeping dread. The baby is 8 weeks along, conceived exactly the night of Greg's company gala. The night you stood me up for our anniversary, Barbara continued relentlessly. I lied about the timeline to make you think it could be yours. I lied about that tender moment after your company party. Her laugh held triumph. There was no tender moment, Daxon. There hasn't been any intimacy between us in over a year. Daxon stared at her with his mouth hanging open, his alcohol-soaked brain struggling to process the magnitude of her revelation. The baby is Greg's, Barbara said, moving to stand beside the man who had shown her what real love looked like. Conceived the night you abandoned me for Brielle, when I finally stopped waiting for a husband who was never coming home to my heart. You bitch, Daxon whispered, the word carrying the venom of a man who had just realized he'd been outplayed completely. Greg moved like a predator. In one fluid motion, he had Daxon pinned against the wall, his forearm across Daxon's throat with just enough pressure to make his point crystal clear. You will never, Greg said, his voice deadly calm, speak to my wife that way again. In fact, you'll never speak to her at all. Are we understood? Daxon nodded frantically, his face reddening from pressure and terror. Greg released him and stepped back, straightening his cufflinks with the casual precision of a man who had just handled an annoying insect. Barbara has something else to tell you. Barbara pulled out her phone again, showing legal documents bearing Skylar's letterhead. Divorce papers, she said with a smile that could have frozen hell. Filed this morning, along with criminal referrals for embezzlement. By tomorrow, everyone will know that Daxon Ravencrest abandoned his pregnant wife for his paid escort, then stole from his clients to afford her services. Your reputation, your career, your freedom, I'm taking it all. You can't prove. I can prove everything, Barbara interrupted, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. Every lie, every theft, every moment you thought you were cleverer than your wife, Marcus Holloway documents very thoroughly, and the FBI finds his evidence quite compelling. Daxon's face went white as the full scope of his destruction hit him. FBI? What do you want? Daxon asked finally, slumping against the wall. I want you gone, Barbara said simply. Tonight, I want you to pack your things and leave this penthouse and never come back. I want you to explain to Brielle why her meal ticket just got cancelled, and I want you to figure out how to rebuild your life from the ashes of your own stupidity. Barbara, please. There is no please, Greg interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority. There's only the choice between leaving quietly or being dragged out by security. Which would you prefer? Daxon looked between them, his wife, who had outplayed him at every turn, and her lover, who had the power to destroy what remained of his career with a single phone call. The mathematical certainty of his defeat was written in every line of his posture. I'll need time to find somewhere to go, he said finally. You have until midnight, Barbara replied. After that, the locks will be changed and your belongings will be donated to charity. As Daxon stumbled toward the stairs, broken and defeated, Barbara felt Greg's arms circle her waist from behind. His hands settled protectively over their child, and she leaned back against his chest with a sigh of pure satisfaction. Are you all right? Greg murmured against her hair. I'm perfect, Barbara said, and for the first time in 3 years, she meant it completely. We're perfect. Through the windows of their penthouse, the city sparkled like fallen stars, full of promise and possibility. Barbara Leslie was finally free to become the woman she was meant to be, loved, cherished, and completely unafraid to fight for her own happiness. The war was over, and she had won everything that mattered. Chapter 9. Empire's Reckoning and New Beginnings. Justice served with love's protection. Revenge, Barbara discovered, tasted even sweeter when served with the promise of true love and a future worth building, especially when your enemy's destruction funded your wedding. 1 month after Daxon's dramatic exit from their penthouse, Barbara stood in Greg's corner office watching her former husband's professional destruction unfold. The financial networks had been covering the Ravencrest scandal relentlessly. Daxon Ravencrest, former senior partner at Sterling and Associates, has been terminated following revelations of embezzlement and professional misconduct, the anchor announced. Sources confirm that Ravencrest had been diverting client funds to support an extramarital affair. Greg muted the television and moved behind Barbara, his hands settling protectively over her growing belly. At 12 weeks, the pregnancy was becoming more visible, and Greg had developed the habit of touching her stomach with the wonder of a man discovering something precious. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, his breath warm against her ear. Barbara leaned back against his chest, watching Daxon's mugshot disappear from the screen. "Only that I waited so long to fight back." The past month had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings and social reckoning. Schuyler had ensured Barbara emerged from the divorce with the penthouse, substantial settlement, and intact reputation. Meanwhile, Marcus's evidence led to criminal charges that would keep Daxon occupied indefinitely. But Brielle's reaction provided the most entertainment. The influencer had lasted 48 hours after the news broke before posting a tearful video about being manipulated by a married man who lied about his finances. She'd blocked Daxon entirely and was already photographed with a tech billionaire who actually possessed real wealth. "She cut ties quickly," Barbara observed. "Intelligent woman," Greg said. "She recognized a sinking ship and jumped overboard. Unlike my dear ex-husband, who apparently thought his charm would weather any storm." Barbara set her phone aside and turned in Greg's arms. "Have you heard from your contacts at Sterling and Associates?" Greg's smile was sharp. "Daxon's been blacklisted from every major firm. No one wants to touch him after the embezzlement charges. Word is he's living in Queens and driving rideshare to pay legal fees." The irony was delicious. The man who once commanded a corner office was now driving strangers around the city. And the criminal charges? Solid. Marcus documented enough financial irregularities to keep the DA busy for months. Even if Daxon avoids prison time, he'll never work in finance again. Greg's expression grew serious. "Barbara, I need you to know that I had nothing to do with the criminal investigation. That was legitimate law enforcement responding to evidence of actual crimes." Barbara cupped his face in her hands, studying the man who had shown her what protection and devotion truly meant. "I know. And even if you had pulled strings, I wouldn't care. He made his choices, Greg. He chose to steal from clients to fund his affair. He chose to lie and cheat and manipulate. All we did was ensure there were consequences." Greg captured her hands in his, bringing them to his lips to press gentle kisses to her palms. "I love your ruthlessness," he said with genuine admiration. "I love that you're strong enough to fight for what you want and smart enough to win." "I learned from the best," Barbara replied, thinking of all the business strategies she'd observed during her time at Chaffee Industries. "You don't build an empire by being passive or hoping other people will do the right thing." "Speaking of empires," Greg said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "I have something to discuss with you." Barbara raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, just significant." Greg moved to his desk, pulling out a leather portfolio that looked official and important. "I've been working with my lawyers on something, and I wanted to get your input before moving forward." He handed her the portfolio, and Barbara opened it to find legal documents that made her breath catch in her throat. Adoption papers, custody agreements, documents that would make Greg the legal father of their child, ensuring that the baby would have his name and his protection from the moment of birth. "Greg," she whispered, scanning the pages with growing emotion. "I know we're not married yet," he said quickly, misreading her silence as hesitation. "But I want this child to be mine in every way that matters. I want them to have my name, my protection, my love. I want to be the father they deserve, not just the man who happens to share their DNA. Barbara looked up from the documents, tears blurring her vision. You want to adopt our baby? I want to claim our family, Greg corrected, his dark eyes intense with emotion. I want the world to know that you and this child belong to me, and I belong to you. The vulnerability in his voice made Barbara's heart ache with love for this complicated, powerful man who'd shown her what real partnership looked like. Yes, she said simply, setting the portfolio aside to throw her arms around his neck. Yes to all of it. Yes to being your family. Yes to building something beautiful together. Yes to giving our child everything we never had. Greg lifted her off her feet, spinning her around his office with exuberant joy. When he set her down, his hands immediately went to her stomach again, that gesture that was becoming second nature to him. I have something else, he said, suddenly looking nervous in a way that was completely unlike his usual commanding confidence. More paperwork, Barbara teased. Not exactly. Greg reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a small velvet box that made Barbara's heart stop completely. Greg, I know this seems fast, he said, dropping to one knee with the grace of a man who had never been more certain of anything. But Barbara, I've spent 45 years building a fortune and thinking that was success. Then you walked into my life and showed me what it feels like to be truly wealthy. Wealthy in love, in partnership, in the kind of happiness that money can't buy. He opened the box to reveal a ring that took Barbara's breath away, a flawless emerald-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones, elegant and timeless, and somehow exactly what she would have chosen for herself. I love your brilliant mind that outmaneuvered a man who thought he was untouchable, Greg continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I love your strength that turned pain into power, your courage that chose to fight rather than surrender. I love that you're carrying our daughter, and that you trusted me to stand beside you when you rebuilt your life from ashes. Barbara was crying now, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life proving that you chose the right man this time, Greg said. I want to build something beautiful with you, raise our children to know what real love looks like, and show the world what happens when two people choose each other completely. Barbara Leslie, will you marry me and make me the luckiest man alive? Yes, Barbara whispered, then louder. Yes, yes, absolutely, yes. Greg slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, then stood to kiss her with the kind of passion that promised a lifetime of being cherished and desired and truly seen. When they finally broke apart, Barbara admired the way the diamond caught the afternoon light streaming through Greg's office windows. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was a symbol of everything she'd fought for: love, respect, a future worth building. When? She asked, already mentally planning the kind of wedding that would announce to the world that she was no longer the desperate wife, begging for scraps of affection. Whenever you want, Greg said, his arms tightening around her. Tomorrow, next month, after the baby is born. I don't care about the timeline, Barbara. I just care about making sure everyone knows you're mine and I'm yours. Barbara thought about Daxon, alone in his studio apartment, facing criminal charges and social exile. She thought about all the people who had watched her marriage crumble and wondered if she was strong enough to rebuild. I want it to be perfect, she said finally. I want a wedding that shows everyone what real love looks like. I want to walk down that aisle knowing that the man waiting for me chose me completely, without reservation or compromise. Then that's what we'll have, Greg promised. Perfect, beautiful, and absolutely ours. As Barbara stood in Greg's arms, wearing his ring and carrying his child, she felt the final pieces of her new life clicking into place. The woman who had spent 3 years making excuses for a man who didn't love her was gone. replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to demand the love she deserved. Sometimes the best revenge really was living well, and Barbara intended to live extraordinarily well for the rest of her days. Chapter 10. Love's Perfect Victory, When True Love Triumphs Over All. The most beautiful weddings, Barbara had learned, weren't the ones that cost the most money. They were the ones where the bride walked down the aisle knowing with absolute certainty that she was loved beyond measure and had destroyed every enemy who'd dared to underestimate her. 4 months after Greg's proposal, Barbara stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, adjusting her wedding gown. The dress was elegant ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves showcasing Greg's diamond bracelet gift. At 7 months pregnant, her gracefully rounded belly created a beautiful silhouette of new life and joy. "You look absolutely radiant," Schuyler said, appearing behind her in emerald bridesmaid attire. "Like a woman about to marry the love of her life." Barbara smiled, one hand moving instinctively to rest on her stomach, where their daughter was growing strong and healthy. The latest ultrasounds had revealed they were having a girl, and Greg's reaction, pure wonder and fierce protectiveness, had confirmed what Barbara already knew. Their child would never doubt she was wanted and cherished. "I feel radiant," Barbara said honestly. "I feel like I'm finally becoming the woman I was always meant to be." Through the cathedral's windows, autumn sunlight painted rainbow patterns across marble floors. The church was full with 500 guests witnessing what society pages called the wedding of the decade. Greg had insisted on inviting everyone who mattered, wanting the world to see that Barbara Chaffee was a woman to be celebrated. "Any nerves?" Schuyler asked, making final adjustments to Barbara's train. "None," Barbara replied, and meant it completely. "The only nervous bride is one who isn't sure she's marrying the right man." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." A soft knock interrupted them, and Cade Winchester peered inside with an easy smile. "The groom is officially climbing the walls with anticipation," he announced. "Greg asked me to tell you that he's been watching the door for the past hour, like a man expecting his salvation to walk through it at any moment." Barbara's laugh was pure joy. "Tell him his salvation will be there in 5 minutes, and that she loves him more than she ever thought possible." The cathedral doors opened and the first notes of Pachelbel's cannon filled the air. Barbara took Schuyler's arm. She'd chosen her best friend to walk her down the aisle, wanting to symbolize that this marriage was her choice, made by a woman in complete control of her destiny. The walk down the cathedral aisle felt like floating. Barbara was aware of 500 guests rising, of photographers and flowers, but all her attention focused on the man waiting at the altar. Greg stood beside the Archbishop with legendary boardroom composure, but Barbara saw the emotion he was controlling. His dark eyes never left her face, and the love she saw there made her heart soar. When she reached the altar and placed her hand in his, Greg's whispered, "You're so beautiful," was meant only for her ears, but the reverence in his voice carried to the first few rows of guests. The ceremony was everything Barbara had dreamed, elegant, meaningful, filled with promises both meant completely. When the Archbishop asked if anyone objected, Barbara felt tension ripple through the congregation. Everyone knew about the scandal, and there had been speculation about whether Daxon might disrupt the proceedings. The church remained silent. Then the cathedral doors burst open with a crash that echoed like a gunshot. Daxon Ravencrest stumbled into the church, drunk and disheveled, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he'd slept in it. His once handsome face was bloated from months of heavy drinking, his hair unkempt, and his steel-gray eyes held the wild desperation of a man who had lost everything. "This is a travesty," he shouted, his voice slurring with alcohol and desperation. "That woman is carrying my child. She's a liar and a manipulator who destroyed my life." A collective gasp rose from the congregation. but Barbara felt only a moment of embarrassment before Greg stepped protectively in front of her, his body a wall between her and Daxon's pathetic display. "Security," Greg said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of authority that made things happen immediately. 4 men in expensive suits materialized, moving toward Daxon with professional efficiency. But Daxon wasn't finished with his performance. 3 years of marriage, he continued, stumbling down the aisle like the drunk he'd become. 3 years I supported her, and this is how she repays me. By stealing my child and giving it to my replacement." Barbara stepped around Greg, facing her ex-husband with the calm composure of a woman who had moved so far beyond his ability to hurt her that his words felt like raindrops against armor. "Daxon," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church with the kind of aristocratic authority that made every guest lean forward, "you're embarrassing yourself in front of 500 witnesses. And you're wrong about everything. I never stole anything from you because you never had anything worth taking." Her response drew soft murmurs of approval from the congregation, and Barbara saw several guests smiling at what was rapidly becoming the most entertaining wedding in recent memory. "The baby," Daxon began desperately. "Is not yours," Barbara interrupted with surgical precision, "as the DNA test I had done proved beyond any doubt. As the conception date that coincides exactly with the night you abandoned me for your 26-year-old prostitute confirms. As everyone in this church knows, because, unlike you, I don't make a habit of living in fantasies." Daxon's face went through a series of expressions as the brutal accuracy of her words hit him. "DNA test? Did you really think I would marry Greg without making absolutely certain about paternity?" Barbara's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "I'm many things, Daxon, but I'm not the naive woman you once married. The baby is Greg's. This marriage is real, and your objection is noted, overruled, and frankly, pathetic." Greg's security team reached Daxon before he could respond, each man taking an arm with professional courtesy that managed to be both respectful and utterly implacable. "Gentlemen," Greg said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church, "please escort Mr. Ravencrest from the premises, and perhaps suggest that he seek help for his obvious substance abuse problem." As Daxon was led away, still protesting and making threats that carried no weight whatsoever, Barbara turned back to Greg with a serene smile. "Now, where were we?" she asked the Archbishop, as if they'd been interrupted by nothing more significant than a minor technical difficulty. The Archbishop, clearly a man experienced with society weddings, cleared his throat and continued, "If there are no further objections—" The rest of the service passed without incident, filled with vows that brought tears to half the congregation and rings that symbolized a love strong enough to weather any storm. When Greg kissed his bride, the applause that filled the cathedral was thunderous, a celebration not just of their marriage but of Barbara's triumphant victory. The reception at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel was everything Barbara had envisioned. She and Greg danced their first dance to "At Last" by Etta James, her head resting on his shoulder as they moved together with the easy grace of 2 people perfectly matched. "Any regrets about the drama during the ceremony?" Greg murmured against her ear. Barbara laughed, the sound pure joy and satisfaction. "Are you kidding? That was the perfect ending to the Daxon chapter of my life. Everyone got to see exactly what kind of man I left, and exactly what kind of man I chose instead." "And what kind of man did you choose?" Greg asked, spinning her gently. "The kind who protects what he loves," Barbara said, looking up into his dark eyes. "The kind who sees my worth and isn't threatened by my strength. The kind who will teach our daughter that she should never settle for less than being completely adored." Greg's response was a kiss that tasted like champagne and promises, and the kind of happiness that would last a lifetime. Near midnight, as the reception was winding down, Barbara stood on the hotel's terrace, overlooking the city lights, one hand on her belly, the other holding sparkling cider. Greg found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Chaffee?" he asked, and Barbara's heart skipped at her new name. "I'm thinking about how different this is from my first wedding," she said honestly. 3 years ago, I walked down the aisle hoping marriage would change Daxon, hoping being a wife would make him love me. Tonight, I married a man who already loves me exactly as I am. Tonight, you married a man who considers himself the luckiest person alive, Greg corrected. A man who gets to spend his life proving you made the right choice. Barbara turned in his arms, studying the face of the man who had shown her what real partnership looked like. "I love you, Greg Chaffee. I love your strength, your intelligence, your absolute refusal to let anyone diminish what belongs to you. But most of all, I love that you see my fire and choose to stand beside it, rather than try to extinguish it." "I love you too, Barbara Chaffee," Greg replied, his hands cradling her face like she was made of precious crystal. "And I love that our daughter is going to grow up watching her parents choose each other every single day the way love is supposed to work." As they kissed under the stars, Barbara felt the final pieces of her new life settling perfectly into place. She was no longer the woman who had waited 3 years for a man who would never choose her. She was Mrs. Gregory Chaffee, soon-to-be mother, and a woman who had learned that the greatest victory wasn't just surviving betrayal, it was transforming it into the foundation for something infinitely better. In the distance, the city sparkled with infinite possibilities, and Barbara knew with absolute certainty that her greatest chapters were still being written. Love had won completely, and it was only the beginning.